Our presentation to
Thank you very much, Marcia. It's lovely to be back with you all today. Thank you for having me. I'm wondering how many of us consider ourselves wounded healers. The wounded healer is a term coined by the Carl Jung and refers to our capacity to be at home in the darkness of our own suffering and to find light therein. The work of the wounded healer is to journey into and through the wounding, to explore it, to learn from it, and to be open to the possibility of finding ourselves traveling from it to somewhere new. The wound is considered our teacher, teaching us something about ourselves. To quote Jung, a good half of every treatment that probes at all deeply consists in the doctor examining their self. It is their hurt that gives a measure of their power to heal. However, the practice of the wounded healer isn't without considerable risk. I'd like to share with you the following metaphor created by Christine Montrose, which outlines the dangers. She refers to the relationship between a psychiatrist and their client, but think of it as any helper assisting anyone in need. And these are Christine's words. The people we work with have fallen through the ice in the middle of a frozen lake. My job, your job, should you take this path, is to go out to them, to be with them on the thin ice, and to work with them to get them out of the frigid water. But you must know that to go out to them on the thin ice, there's a real danger that you'll fall into. So if you go on to do this work, you've got to be anchored to the shore. You can reach out with one hand to the person in the water, but your other hand needs to have a firm grip on the people and the things that connect you to the shore. And if you don't, you lose your patient and you lose yourself. Christine outlines what happens if we aren't sufficiently anchored in helping others. And it's the same when we endeavor to attend to ourselves. Embracing our wound as part of ourselves is radically different from circumnavigating it, from going around it, from avoiding it, or getting stuck in it and endlessly, obsessively recreating or being taken over by it. As wounded healers, we are encouraged to explore, to excavate, and embrace our shadow selves for the purposes of inner peace and self-actualization. But to what extent is it possible to deal with the conflicting parts of our own psyche? Can we truly befriend and integrate the exiles within us? And at what cost? During our time together this morning, we'll explore the concept of self-integration through the lens of trauma-informed spiritual practice. To begin, we hear so much these days about this term self-integration. But what is it? I'm minded to draw upon the words of the Center for Nonviolent Communication, which describes it in the following ways. Self-integration is a body of practices based on nonviolent communication, sometimes abbreviated to NVC, that moves us towards a consciousness of deep, radical self-love, embracing and embodying the core principles of acceptance, presence, spaciousness, and recognition of the unbreakable essence of ourself. They go on to say Self-integration involves holding with loving acceptance whatever emotions or experiences arise, observing them without judgment, making space for all aspects of oneself, and recognizing the inherent wholeness and compassion within. This entails acknowledging and engaging in every part of oneself, no matter how challenging or contradictory, with the intention of understanding and integrating them into the complete tapestry of our sense of self. Practitioners of self-integration have diverse practices, but broadly speaking, they adhere to the following 5 principles, and I'd like to outline these briefly, each in turn. The first principle is accepting what is, holding with loving acceptance whatever arises within ourselves, no matter how painful or challenging or intense. Practitioners consider such experiences as reflections of something beautiful, though to the person experiencing them, they may be packaged as something painful. The second principle is being present to one's whole experience. Practitioners endeavoring to cultivate a quality of presence that allows them to be observers of their experience without drowning in it, to borrow upon the earlier metaphor. They consider this enables them to be present to whatever shows up without self-blame or judgment, or without joining in their own stories. The third principle, followed by practitioners of this practice, is making space for all aspects of me. Practitioners acknowledge the self is whole regardless of how many contradictory elements there may appear to be. They believe in the power of making conscious space for dissenting voices within our psyche, listening to what they may be saying, and holding them with care and acceptance. The fourth principle is understanding self. Who am I? At the heart of this practice, according to the Center for Nonviolent Communication, is that which is considered the unfragmented, unbreakable essence of who we are, which remains fundamentally true no matter what happens. A naturally compassionate, curious, and creative essence. The essence that can hold all the complexities of life. And the final principle I'd like to touch upon is that of self-responsibility by those who practice self-integration. And it's about being in ownership of our own experiences, the recognition of our own choice and our own inner power. Choosing to live authentically with inner alignment with our core values and needs, so that every step we take is an echo of our inner light. And that's a whistle-stop tour of the five core principles that guide the work of many practitioners in the field of self-integration. And you know, friends, up until recently, I would have been very much in alignment with these principles, looking upon self-integration as a route to healing in most circumstances for most people. And whilst I remain open to this practice, I consider myself now equally open to understanding that it is not a heal-all approach. Indeed, if employed in certain contexts and in certain ways, my concern is it has the potential to be quite damaging. Over the course of the last year, I've worked intensively with people who've experienced abuse during childhood within institutional care settings here in Scotland. There's a client group that's experienced the most horrendous forms of physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse. I support these individuals to navigate the Scottish Government's redress scheme so that they may receive an apology from the state for what's happened to them and also receive financial redress. In my experience, for people who have experienced abuse during childhood, taking steps towards seeking redress is a painfully difficult and challenging thing to do. For those seeking justice and closure, they're required to revisit experiences that, in many cases, they have kept buried deep inside. They risk experiencing further trauma in opening up to remembering, recalling, and recounting their most horrific experiences. It's something that many of my clients haven't done before. And for many, the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of closure exacts a heavy price psychologically. In this role, I see my ministry primarily as accompaniment. I share this with you to reflect on the concept of self-integration in relation to people living with deep and enduring trauma. For this group, and in this context, is self-integration the answer? Well, it depends what you're asking and by whom. It is true for some, the invitation to explore the past is something they may wish to engage in, and it might be something that is beneficial and supports their personal healing, whatever they understand by that. But for others, in my experience, recovery from trauma looks far different. It isn't about reconciling conflicting parts of the psyche. Rather, it's more about simply holding the fragments of the presently inhabited sense of self. The fragments that enable the person to function. The fragments that enable the person to have the courage to face the morning, to have the strength to get dressed each day, to find food or to make a meal, or to have the resilience to lift up the phone and answer the calls that they've been too frightened to receive. In short, to simply be able to put one foot in front of the other. Perhaps you might say that examining the applicability of self-integration in relation to survivors of institutional abuse is somewhat narrowing the lens too much. And to that, my friends, I would counter by saying that we live in a world saturated by trauma. It affects each of us, our families, our friends, our colleagues, our communities, our society. Each of us is infused with it, perhaps to the extent that it has become so normalized that we accept it as part of our everyday living. And it's my increasing view that in our trauma-infused existence, healing begins with holding people where they're at, acknowledging the person in the here and now, and simply honoring that. Practices in self-integration encourage us to dismantle the barriers within us. And whilst that might be beneficial for some, it is not a universal truth that is helpful for all. We often create barriers as a defense mechanism, a way of trying to keep us safe. And if we recklessly and prematurely attempt to pull down those barriers within ourselves, or worse still, try to rip down the barriers of others without adequate skills, capacity, preparation, and support, we run the risk of doing untold harm. The wounded healer will be wise to recognize that, on occasion, prodding the wound simply results in creating a bigger wound. Over the years, I have become adept at building compartments within my own life that have become cast iron containers to memories of difficult experiences. And in the everyday, I've developed defensive behaviors as a way of getting through, of coping. And these have numbered choosing to be alone, avoiding people, social interactions, sleeping or switching off to bury difficulties, leaning into various addictions and other forms of self-harm. And whilst I don't despise any of these as healthy behaviors within the contexts in which I've employed them, they were nonetheless my choices at the time, my decisions with regard to how I considered that I could best care for myself. And for good or ill, they were my ways of coping, my ways of trying to keep safe. You'll have heard countless times the old cliche that proffers that we can't truly walk in another's shoes. If we accept this, then an obvious continuation is neither are we entitled, I should say, to foist upon another what healing should look like, how they should be, nor what they should do in order to be whole. This, my friends, is not the work of the wounded healer. And if we think it is, then my view is that we are being led by our ego, which in itself is the antithesis of self-actualization and against the practices of self-integration. Perhaps a benign starting place when seeking to hold another is to ask them what self-care looks like for them. And in asking this, we hold the expectation that what we might hear could be in opposition to our own truths, to what we hold dear. Nonetheless, it is in trying to understand and butting out of trying to look after, or even worse, fix the other, that gives us all the capacity to begin the journey towards healing, a journey which is unique to each and every one of us. Because, friends, the disappointing truth is, as much as we may wish it, we cannot heal another. We really can't. At best, we can simply be alongside, in gentle accompaniment, offering a warm hand, tender heart, an open mind. And sometimes the most we can offer in accompaniment is simply to be there for ourselves in our own woundedness. To my mind, this is the most wholesome gift we can give to ourselves and to each other. To be here now. Friends, I opened this morning with a prayer about our breath. And I'd like to take a moment to return to our breath, to the air that connects us to each other. And I'd like to offer these words by the poet Susan Fairbrother. Last night, I realized I carry so many deaths inside me. Many types of death beyond the kind of losing a loved one. And at the same time, whilst I'm alive, there are fresh breaths always being born. The death of my faith rendered the emergence of supple new beliefs. The death of one persistent need gradually transformed into desire to pursue other forms of fulfillment. And the softer manner I carried myself gave way to a fortitude I would require for enduring tougher times. Throughout life, I have sat bedside to the feeling parts inside me. Some of them lived out their stay, while others wisely knew there'd be births to grace me with hope and with strength. And after they're gone, I visit their graves from time to time, lingering in introspection or in tribute before I move on to the task of daily living. I still hold them in my heart as who I needed to be, what I had to believe in to keep going, and how I allowed myself to feel and to see at that time, all worthy parts of me, ever unfolding, taking me to where it was essential to be. Thank you for listening, friends. For digestion and contemplation, we will listen to a piece of music. It's by Anne-Sophie von Otter, and it's a song some of you may know. It's entitled Like an Angel Passing Through My Room. Thank you again.